Hello, everybody. Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. Today, we're experimenting with something slightly different. We're thrilled that the How to Fix Democracy show, supported by the Bertelsmann Foundation of North America and Humanity in Action, is now working with the John Adams Institute in Amsterdam, Netherlands, on a new series of conversations which hopefully next year in 2022 will also become physical events in addition to this Zoom-like conversation. Nothing beats physical over the virtual. And in November of 2021, the very distinguished writer Patrick Radden Keefe, the author of Empire of Pain, a number of other books, but Empire of Pain is a best-selling book, an acclaimed book. We're thrilled that Patrick Radden Keefe is joining us, and I'm joined by Tracy Metz, who is the director of the John Adams Institute in Amsterdam. So Tracy and I are going to do a joint interview. Let me kick off, Patrick. Again, congratulations on this remarkable book. In very broad terms, you've presented yourself. I was just watching the live event you did in Amsterdam at the John Adams Institute. You present yourself as a storyteller, and you were attracted to this story because of its narrative qualities. In a broad sense, in the context of our How to Fix Democracy series, are there parables, are there lessons of this story for the strengths and weaknesses of contemporary American democracy?
Sure, absolutely. I should say, first of all, thank you both for joining me. It's nice to have the opportunity to talk to you, albeit virtually, and to be meeting with you across the time zones. Yes, yeah. Look, the book is a story about three generations of a family, and I told it very deliberately as a story, as a kind of sweeping narrative saga that covers almost 100 years of the life of this family and their business. But in a deeper sense, I think the story is an indictment of the kinds of systems that allowed the family to do some very bad things over a long period of time. And in particular, a look at the ways in which private money, really colossal private money, I mean, in this case, this is one of the richest families in the United States, is able to co-opt public institutions that should be looking out for consumers and citizens. And so I think certainly, I hope that if you're reading the book closely, you see that it's not just about this one family behaving very badly, but also about a system that has in some ways been corroded by corporate interests to a point where the system that should be protecting consumers and citizens in fact ends up abetting some of the very bad corporate behavior that the book is about.
Do you think it might be fair to call American democracy a form of philanthropic capitalism? The Sacklers are, of course, as you suggested, they were masters at manipulating this system.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different strands in this. So one is the aspect of philanthropy, which is part of what drew me to the story in the first instance, is that I learned that you have the opioid crisis, this terrible public health crisis that has unfolded over a quarter of a century in the United States and has killed 500,000 people or more, and addicted several million more than that. And it's obviously a very complex problem, but one whose origins are not as complex. And it turns out there was this one company, Purdue Pharma, which sort of changed the ways in which American doctors prescribed opioids, these drugs, with devastating results. When I learned that Purdue Pharma was a privately held company owned by the Sackler family, that was really surprising to me because I knew the name Sackler from a completely different context. I knew them as philanthropists, these kind of
Mm.
grand figures of art and culture and education who had bestowed hundreds of millions of dollars upon universities and art museums and put their name up on many of these very elite institutions. So philanthropy is one issue, and looking at the ways in which they may have used this philanthropic giving to kind of launder their own reputation. Um, and then I think there's a kind of connected but somewhat separate issue, which is just the degree to which, and the United States is hardly alone here, but the degree to which our system has been hijacked by the imperatives of the plutocratic elite, that the billionaire class through um, lobbyists, lawyers, influence, money, is able to insulate themselves from, I think what I think should be appropriate consequences for their own reckless decisions.
How could this have remained hidden for so long from the regulatory agencies, from bodies who have oversight over pharmaceuticals? How is this possible?
It's a great question, and I honestly, I mean, it was part of what I was hoping the reader would feel as you're moving through the book, is that you sort of have one little scandal after another, none of which seems to be the big defining. It sort of just gets worse and worse, right?
But nobody picks up on it.
They don't, and in some ways, from the beginning, I knew this would be a story. It's a story of impunity. I mean, it's kind of it's sort of an anatomy of impunity on a very grand scale. I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, I think that the family and the company were pretty canny early on about shooting the messenger. If
They
there
tried
were,
to shoot you.
yeah, they certainly did their best to suppress what I was doing, but I was hardly the first, right? There were other journalists before me, dating back 20 years, who wrote about the family and the company, and they went after those people like a ton of bricks with legal threats, and really doing everything they could to stop the story from getting out. And you see that when you have people internally. I mean, there's a story I tell in the book about a woman who was actually the legal secretary to the general counsel of the company, who was injured and she had pain issues and she started taking Oxycontin and she became addicted. And this is a woman who'd been working at the company for 20 years. She went to work every day on the same floor as the Sacklers. And you might imagine in another company, you're selling a product, it's a huge blockbuster, you're making billions of dollars. You learn that the product is hooking people and killing some people. And then it turns out it actually has addicted this woman who you see every day. How do you respond? And I think there's a range of potential responses. What they did with this particular woman is they fired her after 20 years at the company. They told her to put her stuff in a box and get out. And I think that's fairly characteristic of the approach that they took anytime it looked like there might be some accountability, or even just a reckoning, or somebody saying, hey, slow down, we might have made a terrible mistake here. What they tended to do was assume a very adversarial posture with whoever those people were.
Can we learn about the malfiance of American corporations in your book, or is this exceptional? Are there no broad lessons we can really learn?
It is a very specific story. It's a story about a very specific family. It's quite an eccentric family in some ways, and their privately held company, which bore the imprint of those family members. So in that respect, it is a precise and specific story. But I think that there are a great deal of broader lessons to be learned about corporate governance, about corporate culture, about the kind of groupthink that can take hold. If you have a scenario in which a business organization is doing something controversial, making a huge amount of money doing it, for the rank and file, for people who come to work every day, what's the story that you tell yourself? What's the story that you tell your spouse, the people in your community, about what it is that you're doing? I think a lot of the story about the regulatory failures that's a story that you can generalize. I mean, believe me, my book came out in April in the States, and one of the stories that it tells is about the way in which the FDA was co-opted over decades. And there's a particular story about how in the 1950s, Pfizer, which was a client of Arthur Sackler, effectively bribed an official at the FDA. And at the point where the book came out, I had just had my first shot of the Pfizer vaccine, and I was waiting to get my second one. And it puts me in an interesting situation, particularly in a climate in the US where we have a lot of these vaccine skeptics and people who don't want to get the shot even when it's available to them. Because in some ways, part of what my book is about is that we shouldn't have a kind of blind faith either in the good intentions of these corporations or in the rigor and trustworthiness of the regulatory agencies. And yet at the same time, I think everybody should go out and get their shots. I mean, I tend to think that if you're a kind of reasonably sophisticated person in the 21st century, you should not either have blind faith on the one hand, or alternatively a kind of nihilistic refusal to believe anything, a kind of anti-science. I'm going to go it alone. I trust what I read on the internet instead of what I hear from my doctor, kind of attitude.
The Sacklers have now been punished with a fine, which to most of us would sound massive, $4 billion, if I'm not mistaken, in exchange for not having to accept responsibility or and no further litigation against them. Does that strike you as just punishment?
No, it doesn't. I think there's different ways that you can look at this. One would be the metric of damage. So the opioid crisis, I mean, the estimates of the cost of the opioid crisis are it's more than $2 trillion.
Wow.
Now, obviously, not all of that responsibility lies at the doorstep of the Sacklers. There are plenty of bad actors, and indeed, there's a lot of other litigation going on with pharmacy chains and other pharmaceutical companies and wholesalers, distributors, and so forth. But even just take the figure of money that they're paying, this $4.3 billion that they're paying. If you read the fine print, they're paying it out over 9 years. And the family has an estimated fortune today of $11 billion. So I was looking into this. I was curious just because these numbers, I mean, to me, what is it? $4.3 billion sounds like a lot of money to me. But I interviewed some people who invest the fortunes of high net worth families. And they told me that a family like the Sacklers can conservatively, I mean, if they're really making quite conservative investments plus just interest and other returns, conservatively they can expect an annualized return of roughly 6% on that $11 billion fortune. So when you look at it that way, they're paying $4.3 billion out over 9 years. They can do it just on the returns. They don't have to touch their principal. And in fact, when they're done paying the penalty, they'll have more money than they do today.
Patrick, I'm talking to you from San Francisco. The moment our city is transfixed with the story of Theranos and the trial of Elizabeth Holmes. Are there similarities between what you wrote about and Theranos, basically cooking the books, telling lies to suit their own narrative?
Yeah.
The fake it till you break it mentality, which made Silicon Valley great, right?
Absolutely. And again, there was a sort of wishful thinking on her part that this was going to work, and you sort of fake it till you make it. And she hoped it could come together. So I think there's that. That can kind of tip quite quickly into outright fraud. And I should say that the Sacklers have never been criminally prosecuted. They did do a civil settlement with the Department of Justice. They've never been criminally prosecuted, but their company has twice pled guilty to federal criminal charges that it fraudulently marketed its opioids. But there's another, I mean, I'm glad you asked that, because there's another really interesting aspect of this, which is when you look at Theranos, part of what's so intriguing is that it's pretty outlandish when you look at it in retrospect. You know, one drop of blood can give you the
Yeah.
kind of full diagnostic suite. I mean, it just seems like a science fiction idea.
It's the Holy Grail.
But you had all of these really heavy hitter,
Yeah.
influential people who were on the board.
George
And
Shultz.
absolutely. I mean, any number of people who probably should have known better, but were enlisted in this cause. And George Shultz is a good example. But you know, some of these people started hearing contrary evidence. You know, in his case, from his grandson, and didn't want to listen to it. They didn't want to entertain the notion that the thesis might be wrong. And the sense in which I think there's a deep connection to the Oxycontin story there is that there is some idealism at work, right? It's part of what helps the con is that you're selling an idea that people want to believe in. I mean, if you could have a drop of blood that would give you the full diagnostic rundown and save you all these tests. I mean, imagine the applications. Of course, people would get very rich, but also from a therapeutic point of view, that would be a godsend. It would be amazing. And it was the same thing with Oxycontin. I've interviewed many, many doctors who, in the 90s, promiscuously overprescribed Oxycontin. And in some instances, they did this because they were crooks who knew better but were taking money. But in other instances, it was just that they desperately wanted to believe that there was a cure that they could give to their patients, which would relieve terrible suffering and have no real therapeutic downsides.
There are many sad things about the story, of course, mainly for the people who got addicted and died and suffered, but also on a larger scale for the United States. I mean, if you look at the story of the three brothers, sons of immigrants who had a grocery store, they were pushed to become doctors to better themselves. They did. They made a massive fortune. And then does this story give the lie to the American dream? On the one hand, they really did achieve it, but also the bottom just fell out, especially after reading your book.
So let me answer that in two ways. One is that I'm glad you put it in those terms because part of what I wanted to do with the book was kind of tap into some of the kind of mythic sort of sweep of an American dream story. Like these are archetypal stories that we're all familiar with.
Absolutely.
But I think it is very often the case, I won't say always the case, but very, very often the case, that there's a sanitized version of those stories, and then there's the true version, and the true version often involves a lot of dirt and a lot of oppression, a lot of exploitation, and you know, it's the kind of behind every great fortune notion, right? And so Arthur Sackler comes of age in the 1930s and 40s, and he's surrounded by these names: Frick, Rockefeller, Carnegie. You know, he comes of age when the robber barons were just a generation ago, and they've put their names up all over the New York City, where he goes to medical school, where he becomes a young man. And so I do think that in some ways he kind of grows up in this milieu where that's what you do. You sanitize your fortune, which in the case of the Fricks and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, you know, is not always that pristine a fortune in terms of how it was made. You know, when you talk about accountability and getting away with it, one of the great ironies of this story is that the Sacklers put their name up everywhere in this spirit for decades, for 6-7 decades. And the one place where I think you see some real consequences for the family is that their reputation is now in tatters, and a lot of these institutions are taking the name down. And so that from a kind of narrative point of view is pretty interesting, right? That they kind of get away with it, except that they lose the name, and that their name is now toxic.
Do people really care, though? Patrick, I have to admit that whilst I know the name, I don't, I live in San Francisco, so I'm a Californian Philistine. I don't go to museums very often. So what that their name gets taken down from a museum? Does it really matter?
Well, so there's different ways of looking at that. I mean, does it really matter? In talking as I do with parents who've lost children to opioid overdoses, it's cold comfort for them. It doesn't matter much. That if that's the accountability is that the name comes down, uh, they don't care. I mean, some people would like to see it happen, but it's not going to bring anybody back who's been lost. Um, I think part of the reason I mentioned the kind of mania that the family had for putting the name up all those years is that, to your point, for another family, it might not matter. But the truth is that the kinds of people who give hundreds of millions of dollars away, always with these binding legalistic contracts saying that their name needs to be above the door, are the kinds of people who care. So you don't care. And
I'll
most
bet they do.
pardon me?
I'll bet they do.
They do. Yeah. They're furious about it. And most people who go, say, to the Louvre in Paris probably didn't notice some time ago when what had for 30 years been the Sackler galleries at the Louvre were suddenly rechristened overnight. The name just disappeared. The average tourist isn't going to notice, but you better believe that the family notices.
Patrick, we had the Nobel winning prize economist Angus Deaton on the show last year. He, of course, wrote Death with his wife Anne Case, wrote Deaths of Despair, which in many respects is about the social crisis of Oxycontin. Is the world that Deaton writes about, this world of deaths of despair, this essentially the condition of the white, particularly the white working class, how intimately as a narrative is it bound up with the story of the Sacklers?
Well, I think there are. I think this is very, very complex, and um, I would caveat what I'm about to say with the fact that I couldn't pretend to fully understand all of the complex phenomena that are in play here. I don't know that anybody
Mm,
does.
mm,
Um, the notion of deaths of despair, uh, I think, seems descriptively apt in the sense that there is, particularly in some of these white working class communities, these areas where the industrial job base has left in rural areas. You do see higher suicide rates, higher addiction rates. Um, and so descriptively, I think all of that is right. And I think that the opioid crisis plays into that and overlaps with it to some degree. Where I would be a little bit careful, just speaking for myself, is that that kind of argument has been weaponized by people who are, for instance, in the corner of the Sacklers or the opioid companies. And I've heard this because I've interviewed many people who worked at Purdue Pharma who are desperate to suggest that they never did anything wrong. And what they'll say is, you're pointing the finger in the wrong direction. We have deaths of despair. We have this kind of larger sort of social malaise. And maybe Oxycontin was like a little instrumentality of that, but Oxycontin is not the culprit. The problem
mm,
is, in fact, the sort of dispossession of the white working class or whatever your issue is. And so where I get a little bit uncomfortable is in ascribing too much to that, because I think that there's been a very relentless push over 25 years to say the problem isn't that we have this drug which is potentially quite addictive, and they'll point to anything else, any other rationale.
I'd like to go back for a moment, Patrick, to the decision to actually go ahead and write this book. It started with a couple pieces in the New Yorker in 2017, and you thought, well, this is a fascinating story, but there's not enough material to warrant a book. You said it would be hubris to write this book without being able to really get into the heads of the people I'm writing about. But within a year, you had decided that this was a moral imperative for you to go ahead with this book, even though you knew you would have no access to the Sacklers personally. What was it that made you decide that this was a moral imperative?
Well, so two things changed. The first is that one of the nice things about writing a piece in the New Yorker, I mean, it's often frustrating, to be honest with you, is that when you're working on a piece in isolation, you're trying to find the people you should talk to, and you just don't always know who they are. And then you publish the piece, and suddenly all these people read the piece, and then they find you and they reach out to you. And it's almost any time I write a piece, I'll get a call afterwards from somebody who I wish I had talked to when I was working on it, but I wouldn't have known to find them, and it's only when it comes out that they find me. And so that happened after that piece came out, and there were a lot of people who knew the Sacklers who got in touch with me. But that's not where the moral imperative came in. That persuaded me that there might be a way to do it. The state of Massachusetts, every state in the Union was suing Purdue Pharma over its role in the opioid crisis.
Wow.
The state of Massachusetts became the first state to sue individual members of the Sackler family in their role as board members at the company. And Maura Healey, who was the Attorney General of Massachusetts, prepared a really extensive legal complaint in which she quoted chapter and verse of all these internal documents that she'd obtained through discovery. And I remember this very vividly. It was unsealed, this document, in early 2019, in January 2019. And as I was reading it, I was tweeting. I was sort of live tweeting my own reading of this thing and screenshotting these passages that just absolutely made my jaw drop. They were so shocking. I had wondered as I was writing my piece about them, what was going on behind closed doors? What were the conversations that they were having in private? And I could only speculate. And suddenly here she had the receipts. And by the time I was done with that long Twitter thread, I thought, first, I can write a book because there's going to be access to these documents now that have come out in discovery, plus those people who've gotten in touch with me. But more importantly, I have to write a book because this is a story of such colossal misconduct that I don't want to leave it at a series of tweets. I want to memorialize what really happened and try and set the record straight.
Patrick, reading the book, the issue of pain comes up continually. The sell of the drug, the great seduction of the drug is that it got rid of pain. It reminded me of Brave New World in a way, a world where there is no pain. Is there a dystopian element in a broad sense to this American desire to live without pain, which made Oxycontin such an easy sell into American culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, it's funny, there's a story I tell in the beginning of the book about the three Sackler brothers who end up in the late 1940s working at Creedmoor, which is this massive mental asylum in Queens, New York, a 6,000-bed facility. And the brothers are treating psychiatric patients with the methods of the day, which really was these kind of brute force techniques. So it's electroshock treatment, which they administered thousands and thousands of times, and then eventually the lobotomy. And the brothers were quite idealistic and were appalled that this was the toolkit when it came to helping people who had psychiatric disorders. And they sort of had a fantasy, which is they said, this stuff, you look at something like schizophrenia, it has to be an issue of a chemical imbalance of the brain. And so if it's a chemical problem, then there has to be a chemical solution. And there's this, I think, kind of pure utopian ambition that they had. This is in like 1950. It's just after the Second World War. Penicillin has just totally changed the world. Big pharma is being born all around them. And it's this period of real kind of invention and excitement. And they have this notion that someday there'll be a pill for everything. Better living through chemistry. And what's interesting is that you get that notion, which for them is a critique of the way in which they're dealing with things at Creedmoor. I think, wouldn't it be better if there was just a pill for everything?
Perhaps we need a pill for democracy, Patrick.
Wouldn't that be nice?
One of the things that makes the story of the Sacklers, Patrick, so riveting, and on the one sense very broad, but also very unique, is that they were not only good at pharma, they were super good at marketing. And it seems to me, after reading the book, that it was this combination of talents that really made their business fly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole story, really, more even than the invention of drugs, is about the marketing of drugs and the marketing of everything. I think it's also about the marketing of the family. I mean, what is marketing if not taking one thing and dressing it up as another? It's mutton dressed as lamb. Arthur Sackler in the 1950s doesn't want people to know that he's Mr. Valium, that he made his fortune on Valium. He wants people to think that he's Arthur Sackler, philanthropist, art collector. And he pretty much pulls it off. And so I think you have a similar thing, when I started this project in 2017, people knew the Sacklers as this great philanthropic family, not the family behind Oxycontin, even though they were. And that has always been their skill, their chief skill, is marketing. And it was true with Valium in the 60s, and it was true with Oxycontin in the 90s. It was not so much the kind of creative invention of new products. It was innovations in the way they sold things. And how real or how unique or generic. Arthur Sackler, I interviewed these old guys who, they're all in their 90s now, but who worked in medical advertising in the 1950s. And these guys would say Arthur Sackler invented the wheel. The whole industry we know today sprang from this guy's head. He was a protean, just astonishing, creative personality, for good or ill. As for the others in the family, I think that they kind of followed in his path. So I don't know that they were quite as inventive, but they took these tools that he developed and applied them in a kind of risky and over-the-top way when it came to Oxycontin.
You've made the comparison between the Sacklers and the Carnegies and the Stanfords of the 19th century, these industrial barons. When I think of perhaps the Stanfords or the Carnegies, they were building a kind of American capitalism, and their power was over a working class who physically built the railroads and the rest of the infrastructure of 19th century American industrial capitalism. In terms of this world that the Sacklers have invented, this early 21st century world of kind of ubiquitous healthcare and this confrontation and promise of getting rid of pain, who are the equivalent in early 21st century to the men who built the railroads in the 19th century in terms of this new class structure in American democracy?
It's the consumers. It's the consumers. I mean, it's funny. It's never been my position that OxyContin shouldn't have been invented or sold. And indeed, I talk to people all the time who've been really helped by the drug. So my issue has never been with the sale of the drug per se. It's with the big con about its benefits and its risks. And so to me, the dupes were the average consumers who were told by their doctors, because the doctors were told by Purdue Pharma sales representatives take this and you'll be fine. I've interviewed so many of these people who they go in for surgery and they come out with a huge prescription for Oxycontin, and they find after a couple of weeks that they're kind of struggling and they want to take another pill before they're supposed to, and then they're taking more than they're supposed to, and then at a certain point they realize that if you grind it up, you can get the immediate release of the oxycodone. And when they go back to the surgeon who prescribed it to them in the first place and say, "Hey doc, I'm having trouble with these pills that you gave me," the surgeon says, whoa, I'm not an addiction specialist. Move on.
Tracy, let me hand it over to you for final questions and then maybe for an outro to this show. Thank you again, Patrick. A wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Patrick, you have spoken vividly about the unbelievable resources in the way of lawyers and legal threats that the Sackler family threw at you when they knew that you were starting this book and all the way through. What actually came of all the legal threats to you by the Sackler family? And did it have any impact on the book as we know it, or on its appearance, on its publication date?
Well, so the threats were intense and started very, very early. They started.
You actually said in an interview, Patrick, that you had threatened your wife to paper your bathroom with all the legal letters that you'd gotten.
We have this little powder room that I thought I might have just enough legal letters that we could actually wallpaper the whole powder room. She didn't go for this idea, but no. It was I got a lot of these letters. My publisher did, my magazine did, and all it did was sharpen my resolve, to be honest with you. I mean, I always knew that the book would be scrupulously factual because that's the way that I work, and frankly, I mean, while I would do that for the Sacklers, who are very powerful and threatening to sue me, I would want to be just as scrupulously factual for somebody who was totally powerless and didn't have the resources to come after me. I owe that much to anybody I'm writing about. So I don't know that it changed the book. I certainly wasn't intimidated. I think on some level their efforts backfired because part of the story I wanted to tell was the shoot the messenger story. Part of the story I wanted to tell was that they'd been using these kinds of heavy-handed tactics for 20 years. So each time this vile lawyer that they sent after me sent me one of his long kind of fulminating letters, I would just file it away and think, I wonder which part of this I'll quote in my book. I'm going to include this. So I did give them an opportunity to comment. We had a kind of extensive period where I went to them with a whole series. I hired a woman to fact check the book, a very, very good fact checker, a woman who was one of the people who fact checked Barack Obama's book, and paid her out of my own pocket to fact check the whole book. She sent a whole series of queries just looking for comment from the family, and I actually was standing ready to incorporate, what could have potentially been hundreds of additions to the text had they availed themselves of this opportunity. But what they did was, after kind of delaying for it was 5 weeks after we sent these queries, they came back just with a page saying, we don't trust you, you're unreliable, we're not going to engage with this process at all. So that was pretty much the last I heard from them, and they may yet sue me. If they do, they'll lose, and probably generate a great deal of publicity for the book.
My last words are to thank you, Patrick Radden Keefe, for joining us for this interview, and to thank Andrew Keen, the creator of the series How to Fix Democracy for Bertelsmann International and Humanity in Action, together with the John Adams Institute, for this series of interviews. Our next interviewee will be George Packer on his book, Last Best Hope.